Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a global think-in, which is a signature term created by Katharina in days gone by of the Committee on Global Thought. The Committee on Global Thought, of which Katharina was a founding member and Adam Tooze is a member. The best way I can explain it is to say that Katharina Pistor exemplifies everything that the Committee on Global Thought was created to do, which is to say that she works across disciplinary boundaries, legal, economic, political, and others, that she thinks globally, as you'll know, that she thinks about national and local and legal codes, etc., but in global context, and that she comes up, and she has in this book, with new ideas, ideas that are better suited to the world we live in than many of the ideas that we are heir to. So you are a model for all of us on the Committee on Global Thought. Katharina Pistor is, by formal definition, the Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law and the director of the Center on Global Legal Transformation in the Law School. She's written on all manner of subjects in all manner of journals, again, across the disciplines. She is well known around the world. This book is already on its way to translation in Taiwanese Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, German, and this is just the beginning. So it's a book that has made its mark very, very quickly. And I think you'll see that the reason it's made its mark is because Katharina has made visible to us things that are in this world if you look for them, but are very often not recognized, which in this case is the code of capital that suffuses the global system, but is actually based on national systems. So making visible, conceptualizing, and changing the way we see the world helps us to manage the world and hopefully to change it. Katharina has become recently a legal and economic influencer, okay? That is to say, her Twitter feed is important. She has testified before Congress against the new e-currency Libra proposed by Facebook. And since Zuckerberg is about to appear before Congress, everybody is getting in touch with Katharina to find out what questions to ask him. So I say this because this is not simply, it is a thoroughly scholarly and academic book, but it has real consequences in the world. And so it's a pleasure to be able to have her talk about her book today and then have two extremely broad, globally, interdisciplinarily, etc., colleagues talk about her book. And the first will be Jean Cohen, who is the Neil and Herbert M. Singer Professor of Political Theory and Contemporary Civilization. Most people at Columbia think of her as the guru in political thought that touches on many of the concepts which themselves are changing too in the world today, such as sovereignty and the relationship between constitutional democracy and religion. These are all terms that are not new in terms of approaches, but you have to change the way you think about it if you're thinking about the world today. And Jean is preeminent in that regard. And she's also the co-editor of Constellations, which is a journal some of you may know, a journal of radical democracy. And she's written a lot on civil society, political theory, etc. So she brings to our discussion a grounding in political theory, but also an attentiveness to the changes in the contents that these concepts address. And then we have Adam Tooze, who is the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History and Director of the European Institute. Adam Tooze is a preeminent economic historian of the 20th century. started in German history, but has since written first about Europe and more recently about the world. So the most recent book you may know is called Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. Came out last year. It's essentially a history of the 2008 recession, and it is global. It undertakes to see not only how this happened, but what the effects were, and it brings in China, it brings in other parts of the world. His earlier books, I noticed something. You know, Crashed is the most recent book. The book before that was The Deluge, The Great War and the Remaking of Global Order, and the one before that was The Wages of Destruction. And I thought, this is quite interesting. Very dark titles. You know, in any case, I guess. But the books are anything but dark. They're very accessible. They're very complex and very textured. And so if you don't really understand custom default swaps, there's no time like the present to read Adam's book and see not only what they were, but what the ramifications were and are for the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. So we'll start by asking Katharina just some words about what she's doing in the book and what she's thinking about in terms of the ramifications of the book. Katharina.
Well, thank you very much for these really kind introductory words, and thank you so much to Jean and to Adam for being willing to comment on the book. What I really tried to do in writing this book was to write a book about law for non-lawyers, and that was not an easy endeavor, and I appreciate all the more the efforts that people are making who are not coming from law to try to understand what's going on, because I really do believe that law is central to how we organize our social systems. I started thinking about this in earnest after the financial crisis. I loved Adam's book. I learned a ton from that. And my own sort of perspective on finance at the time was to think about financial systems being deeply constituted, created in law. And then once I've looked into the financial crisis and wrote my paper, which is called A Legal Theory of Finance, I thought the institutions that we are using today to code this complex financial system are actually the same institutions that we've known for at least 400 or 500 years. So when you think about asset-backed securitization, the legal structure of the assets that brought us doom in the 2000 era, and we think about the intermediaries that created them, we find property rights, we find collateral, we find trust, the common law trust, we find corporate law, we find bankruptcy law, and of course we always find contract law because that's everywhere. So that really caught my attention. I started tracing these institutions back in time, and that ultimately led me to the book. So let me just give you a nutshell presentation of the book. I have a clock running here that tells me exactly when I'm at 4:47, which is when I will stop. It almost feels like being in a congressional hearing when you have a clock going backwards actually for 5 minutes. I have a little bit more here. So this led me to the book, and basically the argument I develop in the book is that capital is coded in law. Capital, I basically follow Piketty and others being defined as assets that have the power to generate wealth. And I'm basically saying, give me any object, any claim to future cash flows, any promises or any ideas, and I can flip them into wealth-generating assets by giving them the right legal coding, the right legal DNA, if you wish. I like to use this metaphor of the genetic code, at least as long as my husband is not in the room, who is a geneticist and tells me that the genes are different. But I like the metaphor nonetheless. So when I talk about coding, I don't talk about the codification like the Code Civil in France or the German BGB. I'm talking about the process of creating wealth-generating assets. And I'm basically saying the process is done by grafting certain legal modules, and these are exactly the institutions I mentioned before: contract law, property law, collateral law, trust law, corporate law, bankruptcy law, onto different types of assets, as a result of which they have certain attributes that gives them a comparative advantage or gives their holders a comparative advantage over competing assets. And these attributes are priority, so they're ranked higher than other claims. Durability, you can extend priority in time. Convertibility, which can be a substitute for durability, especially for financial assets. So you can convert them into safer assets. It's not just assigning or transferring a right, but it's the ability to flip an asset into a safer asset, to get cash, really, when you need it, right? And so by doing that, you can lock in past value. And last but not least, you want to have all these three attributes, priority, convertibility, durability, enforced against the world, erga omnes, as the lawyers will like to say, against the world, against anybody, including people who were not at the bargaining table when these rights were created. That's what the state does. So in my story, the state is actually all important, it's central, it has power, but it actually plays a relatively passive role. You basically need enforceability. You need the commitment that these assets will be enforced in the future. Otherwise, you cannot scale systems. You cannot have an anonymous market in which you trade these type of assets. But the state itself does not necessarily select the assets that shall be traded, nor does it necessarily select the coding strategies. That is done by other agents. And these agents I call the masters of the code, and these are the lawyers. These are the lawyers I teach next door. I do teach corporate law and also finance. The lawyers basically can graft, literally, the attributes of the code onto different types of assets by using these different modules, property rights, collateral law, trust, corporate bankruptcy law, and contract law, and basically thereby bestow on these assets new types of attributes. What I do in the book is basically I walk you through how this was done for different types of asset classes. I start with land. Everything starts with land because that's when it all started. It's land, it's debt, it's firms, it's knowledge that is coded in capital. I have not included data yet. That's what people call now the new oil. And I think this is sort of my next research project, actually, to think about data as capital assets. Then I have a chapter that asks the question, how can it be that we have a global capitalist system if capital is coded in law and if the institutions that I just mentioned are actually all domestic private law, right? We don't have global equivalents to the institutions, for the institutions I just mentioned. So this is domestic law. How can that sustain a global system? And my answer to that is that in theory, we could have a single domestic legal system sustain a global capitalist system, provided that all other states recognize and enforce the institutions that that legal system creates. In practice, we have not one but two legal systems that do most of the work. And these are English law and the law of the state of New York, plus Delaware for corporate law. But most of the globally traded financial assets, and these are the most important capital assets today, are coded in the laws of England or the laws of New York. And that is made possible, again, by law. There are rules that we call conflict of law rules or international private law that govern the question which country's laws shall apply to a certain set of issues. And over the last 3 decades or so, countries have given private parties increasingly the power to choose the law under which they can select or can graft their capital assets, and that other countries nonetheless will recognize and enforce these laws. So we have a patchwork. The global system is not supranational, it's not detached from our ground, but it's deeply rooted in at least 2 legal systems, mostly in 2 legal systems, and is held together by these conflict of law rules. And then, of course, I have a chapter that talks about the masters of the code, the lawyers. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. And since Carol pushed me as, what are the ramifications, I have a final chapter that asks about basically the political economy here. And what I tried to set out there is what has to be a much deeper debate than I tackle really in this final chapter. But the issue is here, if law is the material from which we code capital, and private agents such as lawyers have control over these legal devices and can code capital, but law is also the means by which democracies govern themselves. How do we resolve the tension between the private coders picking and choosing law from around the world to advance their private profit-maximizing interests on the one hand, and the interests of democracies to govern themselves. What I do in this chapter, I have a list of what might seem to non-lawyers just minute little tinkering issues. I think if you add them up, they would actually make a difference. But I'm basically trying to take a page out of the script of the lawyers and show how we can roll back their power by finding exactly the vulnerable points where they can use their power to do more. So more I don't really want to say right now. I hope I've sort of addressed the core issues, and then just turn it over to Jean, who will start us off here. Thank you again for coming, and thanks for doing this this afternoon.
Thank you. Shall I?
Yes,
can you hear
please.
me?
I just turned
You
this
can.
on.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to comment on this book. Also terrifying, since I'm neither an economist nor a lawyer, but I am a political theorist. So, all right. Everyone is discussing the huge leap in domestic inequality in Western democracies and globally. Talk of a new Gilded Age is widespread. Equally, if not more important, is the growing power of economic actors and their lawyers over states and over their less fortunate citizens, all of which seems to raise the specter of a new 21st century type of oligarchy. Globalization and neoliberalism are deemed the usual villains, despite the fact, apparently, that automation and new digital technologies have played a quantitatively greater role in deindustrialization and in spatial and income inequalities. But we do know that the surge in economic and legal reforms, at least in the 80s, since the 80s, that prioritized markets over governments did occur, and that states embraced austerity politics in the name of market constraints. All this is now triggering a populist backlash, not only against globalization, global rules, and multilateral treaties, but also against existing domestic democratic rules of the game, both of which have somehow the taint of unfairness because they seem to allow well-positioned elites to take advantage of a rigged playing field. I'll get back to the sovereigntist, nationalist, authoritarian, populist, protectionist version of this revolt and what alternatives there might be in a minute. But I first want to note that the great merit of Pistor's book is that it analyzes the actual mechanisms through which the growth of the power of capital and its managers, the power of capital, its managers, and its private legal coders have occurred, and the processes through which public power has been cowed, instrumentalized, privatized, and eviscerated. Her book takes up, in part, where Piketty's left off. Indeed, she provides a convincing, detailed, and broader analysis of the mechanisms generating inequality than he did, although his book documenting the growing inequality in this century is magisterial. But Pistor's analysis also starts at the stage prior to distribution. It concerns, as she said, how capital is produced. And her equally, in my view, magisterial analysis shows us that the stakes are more than inequality, although that's bad enough. They concern the viability of constitutional democracy and the ability of democratic public power to pursue public and regulatory policy in the public interest, however that's defined, in the 21st century. Put differently, both popular sovereignty and state sovereignty are at risk due to the autonomization of private capital, thanks to the legal coders and their outsized autonomy as lawmakers. So her thesis, I hope I'm getting this right, is that capital is made from two ingredients, assets and the legal code, and that over time the roster of assets coded in law change and expand. This coding occurs through the work of private lawyers using private law of a state, though through which they bestow invaluable attributes on the relevant assets that privilege its holders vis-a-vis others. She mentioned them: durability, priority, universality, convertibility. The power to control the coding of capital is key, I'm quoting her, to the production, not only to the distribution of wealth. And it's her central thesis that the autonomization of lawmaking power in the hands of private lawyers, a prerogative once deemed to be a core attribute of sovereignty or of the sovereign, has had the accumulative effect of bypassing and radically diminishing the autonomy of democratic states to make law in the public interest and to regulate the self-regulation of private legal coders, lawyers. But Pistor also insists on, as we just heard, on the centrality of the state in enabling this private legal coding as state law, because it's crucial for guaranteeing the legality and enforcing the outcomes of, let's say, contracts or whatever, along with the privileges of the legally coded asset holders. So the assets coded in law gain the claim to legality, it's legal, authority and legitimacy for the privileges that they are given, while the state recedes to the background, as Katharina just said, upholding but no longer making the relevant law or really regulating its production or effects. So how does this work? As she shows and said, it's necessary for the state to guarantee legality of global capital, but it doesn't have to be the state in which the contract or the corporation is formed. It can be any state as long as one does it and the others follow suit. Paradoxically, it's states themselves that have torn down the legal barriers that used to make it hard for asset holders to cherry pick among the state law of their liking. Now they recognize foreign law for contracts and other things, and they use the coercive power to enforce it, facilitating both the global expansion of trade, commerce, and finance through legal rules, while eviscerating their individual ability to regulate or impose public rules on the rule makers. The result is that private lawyers coding assets can choose among the extant legal systems and get benefits like low tax rates, minimal regulation, very few environmental laws, few workers' rights, low wages, and all of this, triggering a race to the bottom amongst states competing for capital investment. This enables their clients to avoid the burdens of state law, be it regulatory or redistributionist, environmental or whatever, and the coders of capital become inordinately autonomous, and they and their clients now seem to have their cake and eat it too. They gain the legitimacy of legal coding, and autonomy to code as they please, plus the backup by the coercive powers of a state without being under its public supervision. What a racket. Anyway, so the book articulates a depressing conundrum. Constitutional democracy entails representative self-government under law, and law in a democratic state is the means for achieving and enforcing legitimate public purposes. Law's legitimacy derives from its congruence with constitutional lawmaking processes and democratic norms. The point of constitutional democracy's ideal of self-government under law is to ensure that public power is oriented towards public purposes and that it's accountable and responsive to the citizenry that those in government represent. Popular sovereignty, after all, is supposed to be the foundation of the democratic constitutional state. But constitutional democracies also secure the principle of subjective right, whereby those subject to the law are not only equal before it, but also free, autonomous in a double sense, enabled to make use of their subjective rights as a principle of freedom to act and achieve their own individual and associative purposes and ends without having to give an account of their motives for these actions to government so long as they're legal. And second, they're empowered to make law as private citizens, to contract, to create horizontal obligations amongst one another as individuals. This is the domain of private law, and to invoke the coercive power of the state to back it up. The dilemma this Janus-faced role of law and lawmaking involves is how to secure, as Katharina just said, the right balance between public and private autonomy, between public power of the collectivity, popular and state sovereignty if you want, and the private autonomy of individuals and private associations, including but not only corporations and economic actors. So we don't want to throw out babies with bathwater here. Put differently, Pistor shows that the dilemma has two dimensions. The private autonomy and subjective rights protected by private law have been developed by private lawyers who code capital in ways that increase the private power of some, we can figure out who, resulting in astronomical inequalities of material well-being, power, and standing amongst private actors, thus undermining equality before the law, which private law is supposed to be based on, while eviscerating the ability of the democratic state to counterbalance these inequities and engage in public purpose legislation, et cetera. So we can think about it this way. The markers of sovereignty for the political theorists know this, associated with monarchs ever since Baudin, and with states, Baudin and Hobbes, these were the monopoly of the legitimate means of violence, the making of universally binding law, imposing general taxation, coinage of money, sanctions for delicts, etc. And the modern state was supposed to be supreme regarding these functions domestically and autonomous internationally. Well, these markers of sovereignty seem to be cumulatively eviscerated and usurped by the coders of capital and their powerful corporate clients, let's just use the word privatization here, to the point that today, and this is a different topic, but I have to say it because I got it from her, if one thinks of the digital coders, even the importance of state backing for, say, money seems to be on the way out. But we're not talking about, at least, talking about this later. So why did or do states continue to permit the privatization to occur? And what can be done about it? This is the key, for me, political question, not so much legal, but political question that we face today. So Pistor insists that the power to determine the conduct of law remains with the people in democratic polities and with their states, because the law that codes capital ultimately depends on state enforcement, as we saw. So we Democrats face the following dilemma. Capital holders use law for the private interests with the help of the powerful masters of the code and apparent diminished democratic state sovereignty. Right now, we are in the throes, as I said, of a populist nationalist backlash that is sovereigntist to the extreme, rejecting and renouncing international treaties, global and regional institutions and their regulations, while also undermining democratic norms and principles. And so moving when they're in power, in alarming authoritarian directions. But the alternative of even greater of what Roderick would call hyperglobalization, or that the advocates of radical markets embrace, is hardly an attractive one. The state, on the other hand, as we see, the state can be brought back in to regulate legal coders, corporate capital, and even digital coding, as the current example of China reveals. And we know that India never really bought into the extreme hyperglobalization in the first place, but the price of these approaches seems to be authoritarianism. And as we know, India is increasingly authoritarian. So what do we do? Presumably, we need a certain kind of political will and actors to get us out of this, although it's unclear who these are going to be and how we could do this. So I want to address, just close with looking at, talking about Katharina's solutions very briefly, but also about the way she frames the alternatives. I have the feeling, but I'm not the lawyer here, but I have a feeling that you pose it from, that you frame it in terms of minimal and maximal perspectives that are too far apart. So the minimal is the stuff that you give, which is not minimal, I grant you, but it's nevertheless minimal. And the maximal is sort of a kind of like quasi-revolutionary. Radical markets or this Christoph Menke thing, which I'll get into in a minute. So first, a few questions. First of all, I'm curious to know how you would say your articulation of the dilemma of balancing public and private autonomy differs from Danny Roderick's trilemma, and what way your solution is different. That's just a question. Now, your pragmatic suggestions toward the end of the book are compelling. She says that states should refrain from offering legal privileges over and above the basic code modules. They should reject requests for new exemptions, like preferential tax treatments. They should ensure private arbitration occurs only among equals. That would be good. And give voice to potential losers, reinforce rights of labor, create new property rights in the sense of social entitlements, to social protection, et cetera. And she also says that states should act to make form shopping more difficult by reducing opportunities for asset holders to go on legal shopping sprees. And she says that this doesn't have to be coordinated through legal harmonization. Apparently this is hard to do. But rather the states should one at a time roll back this stuff. But I don't really quite grasp how a single state acting, or single states acting on their own, could avoid the blackmail of corporations and the race to the bottom regarding taxes and other regulations if they didn't coordinate in some way with one another. I mean, there are some powerful states that could do lots of stuff like ours, but still. And how they could avoid, at the same time, the sovereigntist nationalism of the populist right. So it's not, that's fine. It would be great if they would do that, but I'm not sure that that regional and multilateral coordination should be somehow considered so maximal, so difficult to attain. I still tend to think that a lot of work could be done on that track too, and I wonder what you would say about that. And so, of course, I agree that states remain the key locus of democracy and the key actors, but, and that politics has to regain control. But I would also say, again, obviously I have to say this because she knows it, don't we have to rethink sovereignty and the state? I'm referring to a book of mine called Globalization and Sovereignty, to get an adequate approach to the root cause of the problem. In other words, I think we need to rethink political forms of coordination, not just legal harmonization, presuming that I know what that means, but not just legal harmonization, but, you know, I know the European Union doesn't do it. It does a bad job, but it's not such a, it's not so terrible. I mean, there's some things that it does, and perhaps regional and quasi-federal structures could help us get beyond this. So I don't think that's such an unrealistic utopia to go that route. The other question, I have one other question. So I don't know if you're arguing for, I assume you're not arguing for a Polanyian type of re-embedding of markets and private law back into states. Or maybe you would think a reflexive law approach would be better. Regulation of self-regulation that could occur on several levels. So, so let me close by saying that I suspect, in terms of figuring out where the political will is going to come from here. I mean, we do see some political will out there, but we probably have, or somebody has to operate in several tracks. Social movements, counter expertise. Here's one right here. She knows all about this legal coding, and training, and you mentioned this in the book, training counter experts. So the lawyers who do the coding to say, no, we're going to do this another way. We're going to recode this stuff in a way that doesn't eviscerate. And then obviously political will on the levels of parties and above that. So I'll close with that. Maybe later on we're going to have to discuss this overly eager attack on the principle of subjective right that you seem to sort of flirt with from Christoph Menke's book on the critique of rights. I would not go down that road. I think it's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I like some of my subjective rights. I'm not ready to give them up. But anyway, we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Can you hear me at the back? Does this work? Excellent, good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and far from it being anything that Katharina should be thanking us for, it was a real privilege to engage with this book. Katharina and I first met each other really in critical finance circles, talking about the financial crisis, so I thought I would start with an anecdote from the book from that moment, because though, of course, we're all amply familiar with the shenanigans of 2008, it's still jaw-dropping when you learn that when the Lehman Brothers investment bank failed in the middle of September 2008, it consisted of a holding company with 209 registered subsidiaries spread over 26 jurisdictions, 60 of which were in Delaware, 38 were in the UK, 32 in the Cayman Islands. And the process of handling the bankruptcy consumed $2 billion of what was left in terms of the assets of the firm, of which a quarter, $500 million, went to Lehman's own counsel, Weil, Gottschalk, and Mangas. And this is the result, obviously, of highly sophisticating lawyering by those people at Weil, Gottschalk, and Mangas, but it's also, as we, I think, are painfully aware, the result of many decades of the development of, within the legal academia of the United States, centered on what's now notorious as the law and economics movement. And one of the ways I read Katharina's book is as part of the important, I think, and in a certain way brave pushback from within the profession of law in the United States against that decade-long complicity with the systems which produce such massive inequality and financial stability and left all of us as the public and the taxpayers on the hook. So I want to start by, first of all, very briefly locating where I was broadly speaking, I agree with everything that Gina said, locating this text a little bit more within that realm, then talking a little bit about its theory of the way in which law works to create wealth and inequality, to highlight one particular feature of it which struck me very strongly, and which in the end will resolve itself, I think, in the theme that Jean highlighted, which is the question of populism. And then I want to ask one question at the end, which is really just a question, and it's about the state. So to thicken out this description of where Katharina's book is best located, it seems to me that it belongs as part of the now powerful and quite dynamic counter-movement to law and economics, which goes under the title of Law and Political Economy. You can see the twist there. The online manifesto for which is authored by Amy Kapuscinski, who ran a famous seminar at Yale Law School. I'll just read you the manifesto. Our blog begins from the observation that democratic political processes have lost control over fundamental decisions about how resources are allocated in our society. Legal doctrines enable champions of capital to subordinate democracy to the free market. We seek to develop a response by mapping how legal rules concentrate economic and political power amongst dominant social groups and simultaneously build and expand modes of legal thinking which embed the economy and social life. Now, I don't cite that in any way to detract from the originality of Katharina's, but on the contrary, to emphasize that her book is part of, and I think in some ways, one of the most sophisticated general expositions we've had to date of this position. Why do I find it more compelling than some of the texts which have come, shall we say, simply from the American side? I find it more compelling because what Katharina does is to hybridize the indigenous tradition of antitrust, of progressivism, of what's known today as hipster antitrust, with traditions that come from continental political theory and social theory. Jean has already referenced Christoph Menke's work, which I agree is flirting in the background there, this very fundamentalist critique of subjective right. I, as a historian, was immediately prompted to think about Sam Moyn's work, which in some ways is a similarly pitched argument against the hegemony of human rights as a discourse and its perverse effects. And as Sam will tell you, is rooted essentially in a riff on Marcel Gauchet's very broad-based critique of the liberal regime of law and its associations with neoliberalism. So I take your book to be squarely in this expanded continental version of law and political economy, with the extra and additional kicker of your interaction with the people that you and I met over, which is Perry Merling, critical finance, this interesting genre of financial economics which sits in law schools and business schools and in some heterodox economics departments and has given us the counter-expertise. So I think of this as a braided counter-expertise project, law, critical finance, under the sign not just of the American anti-monopoly tradition, but under the sign of a deeper continental theory, which I do think is deeper in its theorization of the relationship between law and capitalism. And I don't just say that out of parochial pride as a Europeanist. The result of it is an incredibly ambitious project, because the book is not just a theory of how law underwrites injustice, and it's not just a theory or a narrative of how law underwrites financial instability. It's like a comprehensive account of law as a driver of what something like Habermas would have called legitimation crisis, in which the crises in one area repressed manifest themselves in others, and exactly in the terrain that Jean was outlining for us so nicely, in the realm of politics and populism. So it's a very dramatic assault on law and its role in global political economy at this moment. Let me, for 5 minutes, hone in, or maybe 3, very precisely on 2 mechanisms in this story. The first is the way in which you highlight, in a brutal way, I think, the role of law in underwriting theft, essentially, primitive accumulation. And the really telling phrase that you develop here is this idea of the feudal calculus as the germ of an element of that primitive accumulation moment that resonates through all of these modern techie metaphors that you also like of molecular biology and IT and coding. At bottom, there is theft. And that is fascinating, again, from this continental political theory point of view, because what that then allows you to do is to theorize reparticularization processes. Exactly what Jean was highlighting, the self-disintegration and self-subversion of a legal system which cannot promise to sustain universality, given that it is fundamentally driven by the feudal calculus, and given half a chance, will resort to particularism to secure the rights once they have been gained. A typical motif of the Frankfurt School critique of law. In your case, rather stretched historically, they would see it as monopoly capitalism. You focus it on, as you see it as a very general trend. The other element of your critique is your interaction with the realm of critical finance. And here what you sketch for us is this extraordinary image of law producing fiction, essentially. Law underwriting the creation of fictitious claims through the mechanisms of financial law. And it's an extraordinary image because what this leaves us with is the sense that in your model, law creates wealth and inequality through two basic mechanisms. And one is theft, and the other one is the racket. Jean used the phrase, and one can't read your book without thinking, this is just simply a shell game racket. And my question really as an economist and as an economic historian is, what kind of a theory of wealth and inequality is it that explains it in terms of theft and a racket? And to answer that question, it seems to me that turning to the third pole of your theory, namely basically the theory of political crisis, is really illuminating. Because I agree with Jean that the book, though it comes at the end, the book feels haunted by the problem of populism. It feels haunted by the way in which, as it were, a hegemonic liberalism is self-subverting. But for me, the irony is that if you had to find a label in the history of political economy for a theory of wealth and inequality that explained it in terms of theft and a racket, you would think Proudhon. All property is theft. What you would not think is Karl Marx, right? Whose theory of wealth and inequality centers on another historic dynamic, which is the historic dynamic of labor and capital accumulation. Now, my first take was, you know what, hang on, this is a huge omission. And you look through the book, and there's very little about labor law. And if this book had been written in the late 70s or early 80s in the critical legal studies kind of moment, it would have been entirely about labor law, I would venture. What does it mean that it's not at the center of your book? You do have the moment about IP and the tech workers, but I'm sure you would agree that, you know, the classic Marxian question of how law structures labor relations is not at the forefront. So I think there's three ways of reading this. You know, a Marxist would say, well, typical, you know, as much as Katharina is a radical law professor, she can't step outside the box of her, you know. And I know people in Brooklyn who'll read the book that way. Another way of reading it is this is an effect of the moment we live in. In other words, all the production, I mean, this is now very crude, but all the production gets done in China, which is a law-free space in liberal terms. I mean, you see what I'm saying? This would be like the crudest possible mapping. So in a sense, this isn't present in our world. But I think by far and away, the most charitable, and in a sense, the interpretation that does your book justice, is your account is ideally suited to the populist moment, because you address what is precisely the populist objection. In other words, they object to the theft and the racket elements of wealth inequality. Broadly speaking, historically, and this is what makes them so ambiguous, they don't really tend to object to the labor component. And of course, there is a real danger in absorbing the terms of the object that you're criticizing into your analysis. But in terms of tailoring the critique, it's very, very of the moment. And I think very, very powerful in that way. And then I am with Jean. Like, it seems to me that there is a space which you've mapped out for a truly radical agenda, which obviously is directed at the institution you work in. It's quite difficult for me as a historian to imagine a critique quite as savage as this of my entire colleagues. Maybe, I guess, in post-colonial studies, race studies, that is exactly the kind of critiques that's leveled, and it's a sense of my own parochialism that doesn't immediately come to mind. But that is, I think, the work that you're doing. But with my last 90 seconds, the question I would ask, and it in a sense follows on from Jean's, is what mediates here? What could possibly mediate? She cited counter-expertise, mobilization. What I really was left wondering about is the state. And I was very struck that in your own presentation of your book, in your shorthand version, you said it's largely passive. And I would agree. In this book, the state is astonishingly passive. And yet, it's an effect, you know, it reads in some moments like a Marxist analysis, but of course you don't want to do that. And so it's very unsteady. But I can't help thinking that in thinking along Jean's lines, where do we find the spaces to moderate this, you know, grim determinism on the one hand and revolutionary aspiration on the other? The work inside the administrative state of the regulators has surely got to be crucial. And of course, in the American case and in the German case, given the dominance of lawyers in both state apparatuses, in a sense it follows from your critique. But I would be very interested to hear where you think the state might fit in your story.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was fantastic. I mean, it's just great to talk to different audiences and to different experts and get these kind of critiques. I'm really moved, and this means a lot. Let me just respond to some of the big issues, and I'll be brief so we can hear more questions from you as well. Jean raised the question about how, for example, my argument relates to Roderick's globalization trilemma. We can't have at the same time globalization or hyper-globalization, democracy and a nation state. We have to choose between, we have to choose two, we can't ever have three. Now, as a lawyer, I'm always dealing with more nuances. So the trilemma is something where I would say, well, you know, we can probably tailor it in such a way that we can have two, but we have to institutionalize it and we have to monitor it very closely. So I think there is some, you know, one could think about how to globalize in a different way. One can also think about how to code assets in a different way. And I think one can think about how to police the boundaries of certain types of institutions in one way or another. And that goes also to some of the points that Adam raised. We had a discussion about my book on Thursday at the law school, and my colleague Giuseppe Mattiacci, an Italian and deeply trained in civil law, he says for a civil lawyer, the key issue is really to police the boundaries of what we call the numerous clauses of property rights. So it used to be the idea that the state defines what a property right is and defines the kind of assets that deserve the kind of property rights protection. And in the civil law system, the boundary between property rights and contracts is pretty clear and has been upheld. Germany does not have a trust. Switzerland now has a trust, but through an international treaty was sneaked back through the back door. Whereas in the common law, beginning with the trusts, but also beginning with a very strong legal profession that has always pushed the boundaries, we have a much more flexible system that has always tried to recombine certain things and create effectively property rights that would not be recognized as such in the civil law system. So from that, you can just see that there are also different legal systems that have addressed this differently. The problem, of course, in our age of globalization goes back to Danny Roderick's model. Yes, hyper-globalization makes things really complicated. If hyper-globalization means that anybody can pick and choose from amongst the systems, legal systems around the world, the ones that best fit their own clients, and nonetheless get the enforcement powers of any state, then we are in a situation where we can't do much, right? So that has to be rolled back, which is also one of the prescriptions I do have in the book, saying, you know, you can't just pick and choose, right? And if we then have to enforce, we're not just leasing out our enforcement powers, we may want to have some monitoring of the merits of the case and deal with that. So that's on the Danny Roderick issue. The Christoph Menke story. So at the end of the book, and this is, was for me the question how to frame this, and maybe this wasn't done perfectly. I'm actually contrasting Menke with another book, with another radical. So basically two straw men, left and right. On the right, we have Eric Posner and Weil, who wrote this book, Radical Markets, last year. Also with Princeton, they basically said, let's just abolish property rights, right? That's sort of the source of all inequality. So we're just bidding for contracts, right? So everybody makes public sort of the value of the house and other assets, and anybody who comes and bids a higher price will get it, right? And I just find this completely crazy. I'm also saying, what kind of state apparatus do you need to enforce this? It's not just going to happen on the market. And by the way, will we have a redistribution of wealth before we start this, or do we do this from here, right? So that's... And so I said, okay, so this is one extreme position. The other extreme position, I think, is, I do quote him more positively, I think, than I do quote the other two. But I think the other extreme position is to say it's all the fault of our subjective rights. And as long as we have that, we can't really get away from that. Now, what I want to say, I think there's truth in that. If we want to have subjective rights deeply sort of embedded in our constitutional frameworks and protect them, we will always have this autonomy-seeking quest to use the law for autonomy also in the wealth sense. So that, I think, creates the kind of dilemma that we are in, but it doesn't have to go into the extremes that we are in. So that's how I use basically these two positions. Where do I go with this? I don't think we can just go and try what Polanyi did, basically saying, well, let's just embed it again. And we know that you can't embed it again. Once the guinea's out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle. You don't really embed. So you have to mobilize other forces. And I do punt on that in the book. I don't really go there. I'm not sure I have a really, really good answer, and what I'm basically suggesting is that we at least have to make sure that the extent to which people can basically mobilize law, mobilize state enforcement without subjecting themselves to normative principles of the societies whose enforcement apparatus they may avail themselves of, that has to be curtailed. That's just a stopgap measure. I agree with that, and I don't really roll out an entire new idea about that. Let me just say a few more words about Adam, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, people have asked me, are you not a sort of a closeted Marxist here? Come out, right? And you know, not really. I think you got it right. And I don't talk about labor, and I got some critique about this when I shopped the book around, you know, I really wanted to talk about capital, and quite frankly, I do think my argument suggests is you don't need to get the surplus from labor. You can actually create your own wealth in these capital assets the way you do this. The surplus is basically from the law and the state's law enforcement powers that you're harvesting, not necessarily from the extracting of labor. And on top of that, this is also a really important point, the assets that are today coded as capital, the most important assets are intangibles, right? Intellectual property rights and finance, they themselves are creatures of the law. And this gets you into this self-reflexive tool. You're creating the assets in law that you then bestow with additional attributes so that you can create even more wealth. And when you look just at the balance sheet of corporations today, you know, what is their market value? You know, how much of that is intellectual property rights, goodwill, financial assets, right? That's really where the wealth is, and it's a fiction. It is a fiction, right? And in that sense, I think you're right. It's both theft at the beginning, enclosure of land, enclosure of knowledge. We've just going through enclosure of data, and it's fiction in terms of creating sort of these legally protected assets. The state. Why does the state do this? I think that's a really important question. The state has done this always to some extent. So if we have some comparative examples in the book as well, where you know, the Maya, they win a constitutional court and their property rights are finally recognized. The state ignores it without the state. So the state tends to protect the rights that are wealth generating. And I hope I don't fall into this more vulgar Marxist things that they captured the state. Well, they don't need to do that. It's actually more sophisticated than that. It works through these more indirect processes. And because it works through the indirect processes and through a highly decentralized system of coding capital in the hands of lawyers in law firms that actually don't even go to court anymore, right? This is another iteration that I suggest at the end of the book. It used to be that the courts are the guardians of the legal protections that we create. But nowadays, most courts have never seen very complex financial contracts, and after the crisis, this really created a problem. So many lawyers would advise their clients to maybe litigate, but then settle privately before a wrong ruling comes down, right? Or to settle in arbitration and then use just the enforcement powers of the state, which basically means is that we allude to state power and we allude to law, but we are distancing ourselves more and more. I'll finish in a second. We're distancing ourselves more and more from the actual authority of the law, right? So I think how to go back there, I think we need a greater assertion of the state. I don't think we can only do this through regulation. I think we have to think about the extent to which private parties can avail themselves of the scope of rights and entitlement and get the enforcement powers as basically committed, granted ex ante. I think there has to be more monitoring ex post. That basically means what arbitration rulings are we enforcing, what other things are we enforcing, and can you freely pick and choose your law? So it's basically the pre-distribution that we have to think about, not only the redistribution at the end. How can we get the states to do that? And I think sort of this populist, you know, issue is a big one. I think, you know, my feeling is sort of what I thought in this book is the people who are barking now, they have a point. Right. We have lost control over the future of our destiny. We have, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at that, and we're increasingly doing this in the digital front as well. And that's what they're rebelling against. I don't think that they've identified their target correctly, so but that's my interpretation. But I think what I want to say is we have to somehow make sure that we find new ways in which we get control and greater participatory control over our future. Law so far is the only tool. I do think that the digits, I gave a talk for Constellation on Saturday about that, is an increasingly important tool that could be both abused but also used. So how to rethink those issues is big. And the final thing I'm going to say is harmonization, I think we all agree, is not necessarily the right step, I just want to remind ourselves that the EU tried to harmonize a lot of private areas of law, corporate law, also contract. It has done probably most effectively in consumer protection. But after this became so painfully slow, they shifted into conflict of law rules, which are the rules by which you can choose the legal system that you want to have, right? So that's the shortcut, but which is then also opening the floodgates to other things. So in some ways, my hope is with the book is also just to make people aware about the mechanism, but also the critical juncture points at which we made decisions that led us here, and to then think from there what we could do to regain that kind of control that I'm seeking again for a polity. And this might be just romanticizing, but I think there's something to be said for a sort of democratic self-governance within constitutional constraints. But let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you. I still think the question of political will and how do we get the states to do this and all that is still out there. I mean, it's really important. I mean, how do you get the will to put the pressure on the right points? I'd like to open the floor to questions, and I think there's a microphone I'm gonna ask you, because this room is hard to hear, to step to the microphone to ask your question. It's right there in the center aisle. If you want a question, would you, you have to go to the microphone though, Richard, because we can't hear from, nobody behind you will hear. Well, if you want to move it around, that'd be great, Darlene. Okay, so you don't have to go there then. Super.
How do you think about cyber currency?
Funny you should ask that.
Well,
What do you think about cyber currency?
So given what I wrote in the book when Libra came out with when Facebook rolled out the Libra in June, I just looked at the governance structure. So I think it's a great idea to think about a global means of exchange that would allow us to have much cheaper and more efficient transactions, especially in the transnational level. I would love to have a more inclusive means of payment that is much cheaper for this unbanked to have access to. I think if we have these goals, I would have never chosen the governance structure that Facebook chose for the Libra. So that's where I come down. So I think cyber currencies can be organized in all kinds of different ways. We can issue them as central bank digital currencies. We can issue them by a cartel. We can issue them in the more decentralized fashion. For me, it's again sort of the power structure is revealed by looking into the underlying governance structure. And I don't like the governance structure of the Libra Association.
Can you explain why?
Why? The Libra Association is a cartel, basically, of now 21 members. It was designed as 28 members. It's a small group of hand-picked companies that are picked by Facebook that are creating a currency that is for profit for the members of the association. The association only fronts as a non-profit. That uses safe assets, which are assets by states that have created effective safety nets for their own assets like sovereign debt and bank deposits without paying for that. They're free riding on our payment system to create a for-profit currency from which they derive the revenue, while at the same time creating the potential of instability, because if there ever is a run on the Libra and we have 2.5 billion people using it, we probably will not have a choice but to bail it out. And I think that went a little too far.
Thank you. Okay, Darlene, maybe there's a question there, Thank you.
Thank you. So this question kind of goes to what Professor Cohen was bringing up in terms of trying to overcome that most fundamental hurdle, which is political will and mobilization. Since it seems that will be such a difficult issue to even begin to figure out, I'm wondering what other avenues, such as shareholder activism that's been on the rise since 2008, focus particularly on ESG issues, environment, social governance. What you think is the potential for change embedded and focusing on, activism among shareholders, outside activists, but also disruptors in different industries, focusing more on mobilizing people to become, I guess, invested in changing the economy through those avenues. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So, I think given our political situation, we do have to be creative and think about multiple tracks at the same time. So one strategy is to say we want to roll back some of the outrageous privileges that the capital has received, and I talked about this before. Another one could also be, let's just quote more capital, right? Let's just quote more capital for others who haven't had it. Let's make their property rights, their interests, their future cash flows more secure than it otherwise was or has been in the past. So when you think about DeSoto, he went around the world and says, let's just title property and then everybody will be happy. They can monetize their assets, they can get a credit, and then they can become rich. Well, they don't, because if there's this proverbial exogenous shock that economists like to talk about, they lose everything. What the English landed elites were able to do after they enclosed the land and got priority rights, they made them durable by throwing their assets into behind basically a trust. They entailed the assets, and they called just the owner a life tenant, and so the creditors couldn't take all their property away. They protected them. That's how capital has always protected themselves. Trust law, to this day, is the most effective way to parse different pools of assets and protect them from different groups of creditors, including the tax authorities. Of course, that's how we get tax evasion, right? So I think we have to target these kind of things, and this is a point that was raised earlier as well. You know, I think what we do in the OECD, we're saying we're targeting tax havens such as the Cayman Islands and others, and I'm just saying, why don't we simply disregard the corporate form of entities that are just tax shells, right? It's a legal privilege to get the corporate form. If you have no employees, you have the same board of directors that every other tax shell in this country has, you're not a real company. We just simply don't treat you as a company for tax purposes. Some countries are already doing this a little bit, but I think we could be much more radical, much more focused on these kind of things. So that goes beyond what you said. I think, you know, corporate social responsibility is big now. The Business Roundtable has come out, right? I think they do this for their own purpose, but I think we should seize the moments of this being back in the debate to think more creatively about how to do this, how to make sure that different interests are more internalized in corporate governance, but they also must be matched with some accountability mechanisms. I don't think it's enough just to put a memo on the board or to have some broad statements by the CEOs. I don't think this works.
Was there a question over here? Yeah, here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Professor Pistor. I really enjoyed your work. I was curious, you discussed in Chapter 6 the case with Eli Lilly and the NAFTA claims against the Canadian government for not extending a patent on a drug that had been around for a while, and they made very slight changes, molecules, typical trick of pharmaceutical companies. And then you mentioned that if it had not been the fact that Canada had the capital to mount a legal battle against this, it would have gone differently. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more extensively on bilateral agreements with countries who don't quite have that legal power?
Yeah. So let me just explain for the rest of the audience. So one of the cases I discuss in this chapter on globalization, I'm basically showing how much power private agents have over states, in part through the bilateral investment treaties, in this case about NAFTA. And in the Eli Lilly case, basically NAFTA was used as a basically super appeals court to scrutinize Canadian courts whether they were right in striking down a patent that Eli Lilly has gotten on sort of kind of murky ways, right? And that's not actually what NAFTA had been conceptualized for. Neither, I think, the investment tribunals had been conceptualized for, that they would basically be a super appeals court. But court decisions have been treated by investment tribunals as state decisions attributable to the state, and therefore also decisions for which you might get damages. And so I'm basically saying, well, Canada stuck it out. I mean, they made a strategic decision, I think, in their argumentation at the beginning, but they stuck it out and said, we go to NAFTA and we will litigate this, and they won after 2 years. I think there are many developing countries who, just under the threat of a potential investor-state dispute resolution mechanism in a closed arbitral tribunal, will retreat, right? Will not enact a certain law, will sort of enact it in a different fashion in order to avoid that they might be subject to multi-million-dollar litigation, because the other side basically has the greater resource to stuck it out. We know this from domestic litigation. If you have more resources, you're more likely to sue, right? And the other side might not. And so this is what I'm saying, is developing countries very often cave in and pay a price with their sovereignty when they are threatened by too many suits. or two powerful suits, I should say.
Darlene here, thank you. That's right, it's an inequality of a different kind.
Yeah, so access to resources.
Just following on that, so in the good times, when sovereigns borrow, they accept either English law or New York State law. When they default, then the crisis comes as to, are they still sovereign? And we had the example of Argentina, and in the negotiations over in I don't know how many times the U.S. courts tried to impose themselves, and then the backlash. And so, where do you see that going forward? I mean, and now there were some issues done now under Argentine law. Do you think that there is a chance that we will splinter up into many, many different laws again?
So this is it's slightly beyond the topic of my book, but I've done some work on that. So let me just briefly comment on that. Many emerging market countries issue their sovereign debt under foreign law and in foreign currencies. And Argentina had to do this because after they had defaulted too many times, creditors give them money only if they do this, by and large. Russia is in the same boat. Some countries have always refused to do this, like India and Bangladesh, never ever pick foreign currency or foreign law. China allows foreign law, never foreign currency. So countries make different choices here. If you have issued your sovereign debt under foreign law and in foreign currency, you have compromised your monetary sovereignty because you don't have the resources. You don't control the resources to pull yourself out of a mess afterwards. You can't just print more money, and you can't just alter the legal basis under which the debt was issued because you don't control the law either. That's why Argentina was dragged in front of a court here in Manhattan for breach of contract, because it was governed by American law, by New York law, and courts in the United States had decided that the issuance of debt is a commercial activities of government and therefore not protected by the sovereign immunity. So you have to put these things together. It's again legal coding, right? But these contracts are governed. So if you're, and I guess the choices that you make here, when you issue your debt, are critical for the sovereignty that you have in the long term. Again, an issue that countries should be much more aware of, because if you trade this off, you just will be doomed. And you look more like a corporation. I think Argentina looks to me more like a private corporation. We can't really liquidate it. But in terms of its posture as a monetary sovereign, then a full monetary sovereign. The U.S. is at the top of the system. Other countries are below. It's a hierarchical on that dimension.
So, yes, Jean and then Adam for a moment.
Oh, wait a minute. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Always takes a second.
It's going to be a little strange, but I want to defend something about Katharina's book against what Adam argued. I'll tell you what I mean. This is not. So I don't think she buys into the populist analysis that the whole thing is really theft and a racket. I don't think that's right. I think that her approach is as systematic, gets at the structural logic of capital as much as any Marxist ever did. And I think that the labor actually is in there, but she doesn't have to repeat Marx for heaven's sake. So, and it's certainly not his mistakes, but labor is there. You talk about labor law later, et cetera, as new property, et cetera. So, I mean, Proudhon was no slouch. After all, he did, I don't buy into the Marxist critique of Proudhon. After all, he did talk about federations. He had a lot going. So I just wanted to say that I think she illuminated a dimension of the systematic structural logic of capital formation that Marx, with his superstructure stuff regarding law, not to mention politics, missed. So I think that one could have both dimensions, although it is quite appropriate to the populist moment. I agree with that. But I just had to say this. I'm sorry.
Adam?
Well, there's a sense, I think, Jean, in which you're protesting too much, in the sense that just let the description sit. It seems to me an accurate description of the intellectual lineage of this position. And we shouldn't, populism is a multivalent term. It's not radioactive. And it has a real relevance in the current moment. I would I wanted to come back to another element in Katharina's treatment, which bears directly on this. But to me, there's a sort of a stage theory of history in your treatment of the story, right? So we start with land. Then there's like factories and stuff, which, with all due respect, we really aren't going to say all that much about. And then we're in finance, and then the new frontier is biotech, and then beyond that there's data. And so it's like a sort of phase theory of capitalism. And there's a presumption, I think, underneath as well that, as it were, the leading edge of new wealth is on each one of those moments. And that I would need more persuading of, and it's not your métier. I completely agree that this is extraordinarily illuminating. It's a series of aperçus. I feel it's less persuasive when, as it were, almost in an involuntary way, a historical narrative slips in, which you're not really in the business of justifying. Like, even your issues about land, you skip back and forth between a modern case in an emerging market and feudalism. The point I think you're trying to make is that, or no, you're clearly making, is that feudal imperative is always there. It doesn't go away. That, I think, is your stronger argument than the phase theory, which in a sense would imply that it's superseded. Especially, and this is a problem that Piketty's had, right? I mean, it turns out that a huge element in the wealth inequality debate is, guess what? The oldest form of property ever, land. And a large part of the dynamics in his inequality data is driven by something that, in a sense, in your scheme has been relegated to the beginning and is now being superseded by new stuff. And of course, the word on the street is data is the new oil or whatever. Well, in that case, it's not a very big part of the story, right? Because land, American real estate, is by a million miles the largest asset class in the world. So I see what I mean. That's for me the kind of slight unease I have about this story, and it's this blending of the historical narrative with the synchronic analysis, which I find very.
Yes. So I should confess that I did study a bit of history while I was doing law, because I've always found law too boring not to do something else. So I'm sort of a closeted historian, but I tried not to. And Carol was really helpful when I wrote my book proposal and I shared it with her. She just says there's too much history here, and she's a historian. So make this faster. You have to just get to the present and you link it to it, and that's basically what I tried in the final version of it. I think what struck me in the story that I wanted to tell is how enormously constant the legal elements are, the legal modules are with which you can code different types of assets. I think the types of assets have changed over time, and I don't really say much about when and why they have changed, except for basically saying, well, Piketty, when he has this chapter in his book, The Metamorphosis of Capital, where he shows how rural land collapsed at the end of the 19th century. I can tell you exactly what happened in the law right there. So that's, I think, interesting. And then as other assets rise, and I basically would say they could not ever have risen sustainably had we not coded them in these type of laws. But I don't want to have a deterministic story of that it has to be automatically yet another asset. Other than to say that I think urban housing, yes, it's sort of rooted to land, but condominiums are just sort of different than just the land. We're creating all these legal categories, and it's deeply funded through debt. So we are in this fictitious or virtual world, very much so. Just one point on Marx, etc. I quote this wonderful story about Marx, how he analyzed the Crédit Mobilier in the 19th century, which was just so on point, right? He fully understood all of the detailed legal issues in that particular case. So he has done some of that, and I think that's sort of, once he gets sort of in these institutional details, I can associate myself with him, and I have also no problem doing that. But I think sort of the grand super theory is probably not exactly what I'm doing. But let me just get more questions.
Are there are other questions? Let's in the back there, please. Thank you for your answers.
Stephanie, in the way back with it.
Stephanie McCurry.
Yes. No. Well, let's see.
That's so nice. She's a historian.
So much. Hi, Katharina. Thank you so much for this book. I'm just really learning a lot. And I wasn't able to get here on time, so I hope this comment isn't wholly out of place. But it's partly prompted by Adam's pointing to the state. And while I was reading your book, it was quite clear the contribution you were making about looking at what happens with the interventions of lawyers and the coding of law the way in which law is indispensable to the coding of capital itself. But I did wonder not just about the state, but about politics and legislation. And it did seem, and again, this is the sort of historian's question, it did seem that at key moments in your account, for example, in the land chapter, that people did need to capture the state at key moments, even if it came in late, and that there had been all kinds of moves made to treat, by lawyers effectively to put land in trust and protect it from creditors and all of that, that in the end they did want legislation written to secure those rights at law, to make it in legislation. And as a 19th century historian, I was thinking about the politics of that. It's still the Corn Laws, and but also about the uncoding, how legislation uncodes property, like slave emancipation, a $4 billion in contemporary terms, many trillions of dollars, 16% of household wealth. So not that it's not already complicated enough, but how do we skip past the question of lawmaking, because where law originates, and how do we skip past it in origin, and how do we skip past it in the current moment, in terms of can we really, maybe you don't want to take a solely Marxist position that you have to capture the state, but how successful would any of them have been at making it, or us at unmaking it, without the political leverage to do that, which it seems to me can't entirely bypass the capturing of the state part.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for coming, and thank you for this question. So I think you're absolutely right. There were certain moments and certain issues where the state had to be won over to pass laws, and you couldn't just do it in a court, right? So what I describe mostly is sort of the coding of capital happens in the law offices where you basically do transactions, or where the country solicitors in the old days just drafted a trust deed and then put it in a drawer and pulled it out at the right moment when the creditors came just to defend against them. There are certain moments where legislation comes. In England, it comes, at the end of the 19th century, finally, that they do the reform of realty, which they had put off for 150 years. The same reforms that they enacted in England at the end of the 19th century were enacted in the US, or in the colonial North America in 1732, which was the Debt Recovery Act, which basically said, we will treat every life tenant as every sort of quasi-owner as a real owner, and we will auction off this land, and we will auction off even the mansion. So by making these comparisons comparatively and also historically, you can see that there are certain political moments where you can really make a change, right? You can basically bust up property by saying, actually, no, we will not regard or disregard your private coding strategy and cut through. The Land Conveyance Act and the Land Settlement Act of 1881 in England did just that. And these moments have to come, and that particular situation was the first time that the landowners no longer had a majority in parliament. So you need these moments to destroy capital for sure. It bounces back relatively quickly, right? We also know this from the white slave owners, right? They lost in economic terms in the short term, but not in the long term. They were able to reconfigure it. In finance in particular, when you talk to the lawyers midtown, they're really sophisticated, and they basically say we can mute or undo the effects of most regulation that comes our way. It just takes a little while. But with the modules of the code, if they're recognized by a court, and if we can convince the regulators to use them, and that's also more a soft conversation than necessarily an adversarial kind of proceeding with the regulators, then we can actually undo the effects of much of what comes down in regulation. And so that's how I see that, yes, at certain moments, if we have the political will, we can do a lot. If we have a massive crisis, like the Great Depression, we do the New Deal, right? If we have sort of a collapse of agriculture in England, we do the Land Conveyance Act, right? In other moments, we just tinker, and we never do enough to really change the system in a radical way. But nonetheless, I think this gives us hope. We all don't want to pray for the kind of crisis that would allow us to, correct the system, and we might needed to do this top down. But even once we had it, I think we have to be aware of the fact that many of these things can be reconfigured in a relatively decentralized fashion. Let me just say, this is why Jean sort of mentioned one of the prescriptions I have. On top of these modules that the private lawyers can control largely, and that they sometimes need a court, but not so often, to verify and vindicate what they have done, sometimes they lobby for legislation. A good example in finance are the bankruptcy safe harbors, right? So where they basically help create the global derivatives markets by lobbying 50 legislatures to change their law so that the counterparties to derivatives transactions can basically ignore the general rules of bankruptcy and settle their claims with one another and walk away, even as everybody else has to wait for the entire procedure. That was key for helping create these global derivatives markets. And so that side lobbies sometimes too, because bankruptcy is mandatory law, it's local law, and you can't easily contract around it. That's when you see them becoming very active. And I think, so again, that gives us a cue, I think, to say, well, certain areas of the law should be mandatory, and states may want to retain control over that or regain control over them and say, you know, you can't contract around this. We will police that. These are the entry points, I think, for reforms from my perspective.
Just a word from Adam on why 2008 did not result in, like you call them tweaks. Can you tell us why 2008 did not result in the kind of changes that was not a moment where the change might occur, or a change might occur?
Well, I think there are two levels. One is the question of political will that has come up again and again and again. The other one is the problem of doing. I mean, crisis has a double side. On the one hand, it's an impulse. On the other hand, it's also an imperative to just act and fix something quite quickly. And then thirdly, there was what turned out to be the really fatal calculus, I think, of the Obama-Geithner types, which was do it without the politics, do it on the inside of the machine, create a form like Dodd-Frank, and then actually all the work is going to be done by the inside regulators, and that, of course, turns out to be incredibly vulnerable to the kind of backlash that we're seeing now, where the form will stay, they won't repeal Dodd-Frank, they'll just eviscerate it. And so that was actually things did change. You only have to talk to any senior banker to know the regulation massively changed. It was painfully, and so the pushback has come. And as soon as the political constellation shifted, but that for me is why the stage is so neuralgic, because that battle is going on under the covers, inside the apparatus itself.
Thank you. Okay, one last question, please. Darlene over there, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I learned a lot from your book. And if my reading of your book is correct, I think one of the recurring notion is that capital is ruled by law and capital rules by law. And I believe in chapter 9, you explained that the rules of capital ruling by law lies in the emergence of modern property rights, which closely related to state power. I'm just curious to know your view on cases where the rule of law or the notion of property rights is not that prevalent. For instance, in the case of China, where the government is the primary owner of capital assets and also the distributor, or in other cases like the oil monarchies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a very, very good question. I think. So the way I would respond to that is that we can constitute state power in different ways. And I think the way we've done this in the West is to constitute it through law, constitutional law, but also basically we can think of the relationship between that law governs between the state and its citizens, like vertical top-down. You can also think about it bottom-up, the citizens against the state. These are our civil and political rights that we defend against the state. I think what really sets the Western legal systems apart from others is the extent to which private parties can organize their private affairs while availing themselves of the powers of the state. That is really unique, and that's the power, that's the source of code for courting capital, and that's sort of unique for these legal systems. China doesn't really like that too much, although it has given away a lot. We have a shadow banking system in China that uses very similar technique. There are thousands of students who come to our law schools and learn the tricks, and they bring them back, and they find alternative ways to do that. I think what I would say about China, I think it's not the formal law as we see it. I think it's the constitution of state power through the combination of the state and the party. And the party's control over key state apparatus, whether it's the military, the bureaucracy, the courts, the police, and increasingly the digital world is how that control exercised. And there are pockets of autonomy where people can use things and do this in a horizontal fashion, but they have much more limited space to avail themselves of the powers of the state to organize their own private affairs. I think that is different.
Thank you very much. Well, I think then that we will, I'm going to ask Katharina, and actually each of you, if you have a final word to say about the discussion and where the problems lie for the future.
I have one. Is this on? Yeah. I have one question where the thing that scared me the most, maybe I didn't get it, but you were talking about arbitration, and that the private lawyers has become so sophisticated, and there's so much bypassing the state that they're even bypassing the courts, and that apparently, maybe I read this wrong, but people in the courts don't even have the same expertise that the private lawyers do, so they can't even handle it. That was really alarming. Is that right?
Well, I think that's how many lawyers see this. So, we have given. So it started with a good idea. It started after World War II with the New York Convention on the recognition and enforcement of foreign international arbitral awards. That was a way to get global trade going without dealing with whether or not countries will enforce each other's courts' decisions on foreign territory. So you basically say if you go to private arbitration, then the countries that commit to this convention will enforce these rulings, and they will not impose their own law. They will just enforce them if due process was granted, if not something outrageous happened, right? Okay, so today this is of course the tool to basically contract out of the court system of most countries, use private arbitration, and nonetheless get enforcement. And the more you use arbitration and the less you use the courts, the less expertise they have. I even heard this from a Supreme Court justice on the German Civil Supreme Court, which she basically says we only get the mom and pop disputes. We no longer get the big multi-million-dollar disputes. They all go to private arbitration. The arbiters are private lawyers. The judges are not supposed to review the rulings, but simply to execute them. The only thing that they can do is if somebody makes a powerful case that this is against the ordre public, which is not just the public order, it's really something outrageous, then they might review that. Again, this is, I think, a vulnerability where I think maybe we shouldn't just do that, right? And then, if you follow the Supreme Court decisions in these countries, we're getting this into labor contracts, we're getting this into consumer contracts, we're basically signing off in these contracts class action suits, which is the only thing how we can collectively do something for people who don't have the bargaining power. So if you allow them to go into arbitration and waive class action, then it's each individual of us in a private arbitral behind the closed doors proceeding with the company that we're suing and the lawyers who are arbitrating. We don't have a chance to fight that battle. So I think that's something, you should be scared. I think, and that's something that we should change.
Okay.
Did you have a word?
Following on immediately from that, it would seem it might be quite interesting to revisit the classic era of labour law, where the question of voluntarism and the state enforceability of privately negotiated contracts was absolutely key to the power balance. But I really wanted to ask, well, not to ask, but just to comment on the fact that folks like us so often find ourselves saying exactly what you said, namely, we just need the right kind of crisis. No, we're faced with this question of action and faced with this question of where does will come from for change in light of problems which seem like they have solutions, which are not structurally inescapable. We end up saying, we say that about the Eurozone, we say that about the climate. That trope recurring strikes me as highly significant and really rather emblematic of our situation.
Yeah, I don't really want to go there because we never know how we get out at the end of the tunnel.
We
side,
do,
right?
don't we?
We do. We kind of do. That's where we don't want to go. The final thing I want to say, I want to talk about the lawyers. I teach law students. I am at a major law school. We are a major feeder school for Wall Street. So I think what I want to say, I think many students come to us in a highly idealistic fashion. They do want to do better. They do believe in the law in a way, and for me, this is also I'm writing also the book in part for them because they have also asked questions and they're trying to find new solutions, and they're smart. And I think if we just used a fraction of the brain power that is currently going into coding capital for coding other things, we would be in a much better world. So I think this is another indirect strategy, but that's sort of my hidden hope. And I know from the best email I got over the summer after the book came out is one of my students says, "Can we please do a reading group on your book?" So I like that, and so I have some hopes. Thank you.
So don't kill all the lawyers. Start with the lawyers. Thank you very much.